Did you know that not all watercolor paints are created equal, and choosing the wrong pigment can actually be sabotaging your work even before you start? Whether you're buying your first set of paints or you're looking to upgrade your watercolor supplies, knowing how to read and understand these type of properties can help you choose the pigments that work perfectly for your kind of art. Hi, I'm Kanchan. I'm a self-taught watercolor artist, illustrator, and an art educator. I also have a small creative business where I design and sell watercolor brushes and paper that pair perfectly for my style of painting. And over the years, I have tried a lot of watercolor paints, so you bet I kinda know what actually matters. So let's dive right in. We will start by reading the pigments. Now, if you're not the kind of person who mixes a lot of paints to create unique colors for your artwork, then you may not want to know about this. Me, I prefer having paint straight out of the tube. I barely ever mix, only to create maybe lighter or darker tones. I feel in watercolors, especially in botanical, that kind of dulls down the paints a little bit. So I prefer, if I'm using a lot of different pinks, I prefer like a range of pinks on my palette. But if you're the kind who wants to mix paints and create beautiful new colors, then you might want to know about pigments. If not, you can skip this part. Every color will have a name which is called the common name. So in this case, indigo is the common name, which will be mentioned on the tube. They may look similar, but depending upon the pigments, they have different properties. So before we start looking at the properties, we need to know the pigments. So look at the back of this tube. For example, for the Shinhan, you can see the indigo pigment is defined here, which is PB66. Now, what does that mean? Each pigment is defined by an abbreviation. So PB stands for blue. Similarly, we have PW, which is for white, PY for yellow, PO for orange, PR for red, PV for violet, PB for blue, like I mentioned, PG for green, PBR or NBR for brown, and PBK for black. Now let's look at the pigments for the cotton color. Here you can see the pigments used are three different pigments: PBK7, PB29 and PB15. So when you see these pigments based on their mixture, since PWC uses only one pigment while Cotman uses three different pigments, they will have different properties. Now let's look how to read the properties. So as you can see, some paints are created with mixed pigments and some paints are created with single pigments. Single pigment paints are usually preferred if you're mixing to create secondary or tertiary paints, because that creates slightly more vibrant secondary and tertiary colors. But if you're creating mixes with pre-mixed pigments, you might get dull or muddy mixes. So that's the only reason why you might want to know how to read the pigments on your paint. But I would rather skip it because I don't really mix so much, so I don't really read the pigments as much. Now let's look how to read the properties of each paint or each tube that you have and why it is important. Starting with Winsor & Newton professional grade colors. In this, the first property we'll look at is permanence, which is defined at the front of the tube with permanence A mentioned here. Paints deteriorate over time, and when we have the permanence, in this case it is defined by alphabets. AA is extremely permanent, which is the most durable. Then we have A, which is defined by these two tubes, which is permanent. Then we have P as well, which is moderately durable. As a student, the property of permanence may not be that important for you as of now because you're just painting to learn. But if you are a professional, you're getting into professional art and you're planning to sell or display your art, then you might want to start thinking about permanence at that point of time. The next property is the transparency. So you can see that the watercolors are defined by 4 levels of transparency: transparent, semi-transparent, semi-opaque, and opaque. So now let's look at the tubes again. In the case of the quinacridone gold, this is a transparent pigment. As you can see, it has a blank square, which is a transparent pigment symbol. And when I look at the cadmium-free deep red, the tube has a opaque symbol, which is a completely black square. So this is how you can read the different tubes by Winsor & Newton. Transparency would be a property that you're looking for if you're layering a lot of watercolors and you want to show different layers visible in your painting. I would envision something like underwater scenes or landscapes. Even botanical art to some extent would need transparency. It's not one of the properties that I go for or I have a constraint for. I'm okay with opaque paints as well, but sometimes sometimes you would want transparency to show layering. Now, let me show you another brand, which is the Shinhan PWC paints, which is another of my favorite brands. So for the PWC brand, you can see that transparency is defined the same way as Winsor & Newton. We have 4 different transparency types. Here you see the term lightfastness is used instead of permanence. The difference between lightfastness and permanence is that permanence is a more holistic term. However, lightfastness is only looking at the degradation of paints over time with exposure to sunlight. So in case of PWC, we are looking at only the lightfastness of these paints. Similarly, there's another brand which is the Schminke brand, which uses different notations to indicate its properties. Lightfastness are defined by stars, but in this case, they have 6 different levels and 5 stars being extremely good. Then transparency is again defined by 4 different levels, which seems to be common across brands. But in this case, they also have a triangle which defines the staining, semi-staining, and non-staining properties of watercolors. The staining property of watercolors basically means how easy it would be for you to pick up the paint from the paper. Lifting paint from the paper is a very important property for botanical artists like us because it helps you create that bright highlights, especially on petals and leaves. So I really look for a paint which is easy to lift. Even if it is opaque, I'm perfectly fine with it, but it should be easy to lift from the paper. There is one more property of paints which is called the granulation property. Granulation is actually just a natural property of certain pigments to agglomerate on the paper. This is not a lack of quality, but it can be used consciously for special effects. So for example, you can see here I have used granulation to create these dramatic landscapes. To sum it up, we have 4 different properties of paints: transparency or opacity, staining or non-staining, lightfastness or the permanence of these paints, granulation. So now you know how to read all these properties. I know it can be a little overwhelming to read so many different color charts from so many different brands, but now we have ChatGPT, which can actually make the process a lot simpler. I have another video which I've linked here. You can watch that, how I use ChatGPT to create my own palette using all these constraints that I have for the properties. So you don't have to read 100 different charts, and it can be a lot simpler. But again, it is good for an artist to understand these properties, how to read these properties. As an artist, it is important, but you don't have to read so many different charts to curate your own watercolor palette. You can use AI to do it. So don't forget to watch that video as well. And I'll see you next time.